in one of your essays, you said the future belongs to the young generation. And I want to know because our generation, I believe you, like the young generation, I believe you mean the 25-year-olds, the one who are fighting for freedom in Syria and Libya, I guess?
No,
or
I
even
just
younger
mean
ones?
anybody, you know, anybody, even people who are 2 years old. I mean, the people who are 2 years old today, in 20 years, they're going to be 22. So when is future? Future starts tomorrow.
That's nice.
Future, in a way, starts today.
Okay,
so we are always moving towards future. So the younger you are, the more future, if all goes naturally, the more future you have. So naturally, if everything goes well, a 2-year-old has more of a future, sort of say, than a 20-year-old or 25-year-old, right? So again, it's a matter of perspective.
Well, nowadays it's not really sure because we don't know how long our world will last.
No, that's true. But I mean, if you want to,
Yeah, you know,
we cannot be fatalists. You know, so you know, under normal circumstances, if no asteroid hits Earth or there's no nuclear annihilation or you know whatever, naturally a 2-year-old is going to live longer. So that's what I mean by that. You know, the younger you are, the more future you have, and that means the more opportunities you have to make the world a better place.
That's for sure.
You know, and the more opportunity you have not to become complacent, because complacency is a plague. When it comes to social justice, you have some German background. I mean, I always speak about, when I speak about democracy, I give various examples. Like, I give examples about, you know, the democracy in Canada, democracy in, let's say, Germany, democracy, let's say, in Russia, democracy in China. These are various examples of it. You know, Germany was a democratic place when Hitler came into power. It had the democratic process. Yes, he was elected. So, does democracy mean immunity against dictatorship? No.
And then in the same way, you're not sure if a republic is good or not, because look at England, it's not a republic, but it's better than...
Exactly.
That's a really complicated question, actually.
So I think what it translates in practical terms is that if young people are educated to think critically and not to take the official's word as the word of God, and the general truth kind of say. So if we are trained to question anything that our politicians say to us, we have less chances of becoming complacent. And if we are not complacent, we are better equipped to stop dictatorships in any form from happening.
Yeah, I understand what you say here, but that would mean, because since like the stately education cannot possibly do that because it's ruled by the state.
I'm not talking about state education.
Yeah, the parents have to do that.
Yes. I'm talking in a country like Canada. You know, if you live early in a democracy, state education is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, in Canada, one of the the main ideas that we are trying to have in our education system is to teach kids critical thinking.
Yeah.
So, but let's say in China or in Iran, where government, which is a dictatorial government with an ideology of its own, where they are trying to plan that education, then there's an issue. But nowadays, I mean, with Google, if you have access to the internet, of course, information doesn't necessarily translate into wisdom. There's a difference.
Turns into knowledge, but not necessarily wisdom.
What is wisdom? Wisdom is when you're equipped to take the knowledge and translate it into practical terms to make things better. That is the wisdom. So, you know, but that method can be taught to children by parents.
But don't you think, like I'm gonna take the Muslim world for now, because I think that our Occidental world is pretty well off on that question, because the parents have been taught by the state to think critically, more or less. But now in the Muslim world, it isn't really the same, because the parents, well, from what I've heard, I'm not a specialist of those matters, but the parents seem to give their children sometimes a very strict Muslim education. That's not so critical when it comes to religion, because the state is a religion, more or less.
Yes, absolutely.
So
and
it
you're
doesn't
right.
work that way.
You're absolutely right. But what happens here? I'm going to tell you what happens here. How old are you?
I'm 16.
16. So I remember very clearly when I was 16. I was 16 and I was arrested, so I can't forget. So my parents were secular. My parents, even though we were Christian, by upbringing. My parents were entirely secular. My dad was completely against the idea of God. As even when I was 13 years old, I was always challenging my parents' way of thinking, not because they had taught me to do that. My parents and I, we hardly even had a relationship. We lived in the same house, but we hardly ever spoke. We hardly ever saw each other. So I grew up on my own. When you grow up on your own, you have an advantage. You have to make sense of things by yourself. Not always a good thing, but you learn a way to your own unique way to analyze the world that is not based on ideology, is based on practicality. People who grow up in a jungle on their own, now I didn't grow up in a jungle, I grew up in a city, but sort of say, it's in a way it's a jungle. You know, I created my own rules of logic of how to do things in order to survive, not that it always worked. The beauty about teenagers, no matter what their background is, whether they're Muslim, they're Buddhist, they're atheist, doesn't matter, is that they challenge. It doesn't matter how you have been raised. It is in our DNA. When we become teenagers, we question everything. It is almost its own universe of critical thinking.
Yeah, but then doesn't that thinking depend mostly on the friends? And if those friends have had the education of the parents and stuff like that, then your ideology might be...
No, because all of your friends are teenagers. And everybody's challenging everything, not necessarily because it is the right thing to do, because even if you have been brought up in a good, democratic, critical thinking, encouraging system, still, when you hit your teenage years, you're going to be challenging that, which by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a phase, it is a time that if you survive it, let's face it, a lot of teenagers, I did some really stupid, crazy things.
But you survived it pretty well.
I survived. So if you survive those years, once you're 25 years old and you look back, you're going to think, oh, I learned so much from that experience, good or bad. You know, but I learned so much. So that is, in a way, what is happening in the Arab world. I don't know how much, but from here, I'm going to the Oslo Freedom Forum. And in the Oslo Freedom Forum, we have young leaders coming from the Arab world, from Muslim countries. Last year, we had this lovely young woman who challenged the Saudi Arabia system by driving. And then she videotaped herself.
Oh gosh, that is pretty courageous.
She put it online. And then, of course, the authorities, they come at her. Like right now, she cannot live in Saudi Arabia anymore. Now she lives in Dubai. So, you know, there are these new ways now of challenging the system. You know, a young woman who had grown up in Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia, it's one of the most limiting societies when it comes to women. I mean, a woman cannot go out without male accompaniment. I mean, if we lived in Saudi Arabia, if you were my son, I couldn't go out unless you accompanied me. I couldn't even put the garbage out on the curb for the garbage truck to come and take it. You had to come with me.
It is ridiculous.
You know, it's insane. But yet there is this young woman who has grown up with all of that. But one day she sits down and she says, wait a second. Why can he drive and why can't I drive? These are natural human desires that we want to have possibilities. We want to be, these are not things that can necessarily be limited by ideology. They can be limited for a while through fear, intimidation, brainwashing. Look at Soviet Russia. For so many years, it survived, limiting its people. In China, you have a lot of limitation, even today, that, you know, you cannot go on Facebook in China. So these limitations are put in place, but they expire because the human spirit challenges limits. We don't like limits to be set upon us. So no matter how your upbringing is, Islamism is an ideology, like any ideology, and it tries to limit people. But young people, they begin to challenge it. Now, for example, right now in Egypt, the revolution is continuing, because now there's another government in Egypt, the government of Morsi, which is trying to put limits on the people. And the young people are continuing to challenge that. Are they going to succeed within the next year or two? Probably not.
But then within 10 years, they might. They will,
but
actually.
We are talking about history. In geology, 1,000,000 years
it's not.
is nothing. In history, 10 years? 20 is a blink of an eye.
Yeah, it's not really too much.
Yes, so you have to think of the evolutionary process. And the evolutionary process in history, I mean, in France. When was the French Revolution?
Oh, yeah.
It's recent.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
Not all too much, but it is, yeah.
It's recent. You know, when it comes to history, it is recent. But, you know, if you compare the French society today from the way it was 200 years ago, it's very different. So, you know, you have to look at 200 years down the road and then decide how you can help this movement that is going to go ahead for a very, very long stretch of time. And how can you hasten that movement without damaging it? Because let's face it, sometimes if you want to hasten something too much, you're actually going to damage.
Yeah, we saw that in Afghanistan as an example, or
so
in Iraq.
There you go.
And right now, the generation who's trying to overthrow the government in Syria or Egypt, who wants to put a democracy, let's face the scenario in which they fail to do that. There will still be the younger generation that will have an idea of what democracy really is like, and they will try again, and then their sons will try. And it's the same in Afghanistan, because right now, like, let's face it, it's a defeat for the democracy.
Definitely.
But the people now know how it is, and so maybe they will want to come back. But it's not really sure, because before the Taliban, they also had a kind of democracy. And
they did, but it wasn't. No, before Taliban, it wasn't democracy. Before Taliban, it was a monarchy. And no, you probably haven't been to Afghanistan.
Oh, no.
Okay,
Not yet.
silly question. I lived for 3 years at the border of, I don't know how much you know about geography, but Iran, if this is Iran, okay, Afghanistan is up here, Pakistan is up here. I lived inside Iran, but just at the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So where the three borders meet, I lived right there. It is desert. It's desert. There's no other way to put it. You go out there and all you see is sand, as far as I can see, and there's just little pockets of vegetation where there's underground water. There, survival is a challenge. Nothing grows there, really.
Gosh.
Yeah. So in a society where people are trying to survive, democracy is the furthest thing from their minds.
Yeah, sure.
It's
and
not
in
an
a crisis
issue.
situation like that, you need a strong government, and I believe.
Yeah, and that's where the dictatorships come in. But the reality is that, again, if you look at the evolutionary process, things tend to evolve. I mean, in a place like that, with all the advances in technology worldwide, gradually, I'm talking about, again, 200 years, this will enter the realm of Afghanistan. And these people are going to say, well, how can we make our lives a little bit better? But this movement is so slow that it's hard to see to the, for the naked eye.
We needed like half a century to do that. And let them
so in a place like Afghanistan, things are even slower than they would be in a place like this. So you need to have that eye for things. And war and tanks and bombs can never help the evolution in the long run, because they would actually make the ground more fertile for ideology, for more war, for hate, that sort of thing. So we have actually, in reality, the West has stood in the way of evolution in Afghanistan. If you have lived there, you can see it.
Well, in the Muslim world in general, let's say.
And you know, I lived in that area. Like, this was in the late 80s, so this was still during the time of the Soviet occupation. And the Afghani people that I dealt with, and the people of those, they were kind, they were warm, they were generous. I never felt unsafe, you know, and there was goodness in them. But war always makes people fearful. They make them trust each other less. You know, back then, Americans in the 80s were looked in a positive light because they were anti-Soviet occupation. They were helping, you know, the resistance. But now, fast forward 2013, if you're an American and you're walking down the street in that region, you're dead meat.
Oh yeah.
You know, so what? You know, we have to think about what created that problem. And we are a part of it. You know?
And like you talked about the fact that in the desert, people have to fight for survival, and that henceforth, like democracy isn't really a necessity because first they have to live before having that. But then in the cities, like Tehran or I just forgot the name.
Which one?
The Afghan.
Kabul.
Yeah, Kabul. Sorry.
Yeah.
How could I forget that name?
I live there, so I can't forget.
There are more evoluted than the people in the desert.
Yeah.
And the people in the desert depend upon them because, like history has shown us, that everything happens in the towns and not in the desert.
It does.
So don't you think we should at least try to put a democracy in the towns? I don't mean by doing this by force like the Americans do. But,
no, the issue is democracy cannot be put in a box and granted. Okay, democracy cannot be contained in a neat wrapped package. Democracy is a process. Even in France, democracy is not perfect.
Years,
In Canada, democracy is movement. Without movement, democracy becomes stagnant. And each country has its own way to move. And sometimes we move forward, then we move backward, we move forward, we move back. I mean, Germany moved
well,
here.
even France did.
Yeah, and then, and even France. And then it kind of jumped ahead. So we have these backward periods and then we have forward periods. In Iran, because it is a terrible dictatorship and it's very centralized and it's very military, the reality is that there is so much power in the hands of the central government, and they have guns pointed to the heads of their citizens in the big cities. So the citizen in the big city, she or he wants democracy, but if she budges and opens her mouth to say, I want democracy, she's going to be shot. Okay? Kind of think Soviet Union, think Nazi Germany. But did the Soviet Union last forever? No, it did not. Did the Nazi Germany last forever? No, it did not. These dictatorships, they're like viruses. They have their own lifespan and they expire because the body, the immune system will overcome them or it will die. So these countries, they either have to dissolve and become something else, or they need to evolve and get rid of that dictator. China is right now evolving. We don't even know what is China. Nobody knows. What is it going to become?
Well, we know it's an economic superpower, but that's
but what can an economic superpower last forever and just continue to be the way it is, one-party system without democracy? There's a lot of democratic movement in China. Are they going to be able to contain that? Probably not. Because again, there are certain human desires. Now they can be contained the way they're being contained. Kabul and Tehran are very different stories because in Kabul it's very tribal. Even in Kabul, even in big cities, there is no strong central government. The government of Karzai in Afghanistan is not powerful at all.
It's more like the clan leaders.
Yeah, it can. So the situation in Kabul is very different than the situation in Tehran. Tehran, you have a very strong central government. It has a lot of guns. It has a lot of money, and it's controlling its population. So, even when you're talking about the Middle East, you have to be very careful. Which country? They're different, right?
Yeah, we shouldn't tend to generalize everything as we do. And I now have a question that just came to my mind. After the French Revolution, so we had like maybe, 15 years of republic, then 15 years of an empire, then we came back to royalty, then we came back to an empire, then we came back to a republic, then we came back to an empire. Do you think it's kind of the same process in Iran right now, because they had a kind of democracy, then they came back to the Shah, then they came back to a kind of Islamic government, and they had revolutions all the time? Do you think it's comparable? Do you think we could?
I think it can be compared because societies, they have to try things out, kind of like a teenager. You have to try things out and then see. But the problem with the society is that you have 30, 40, 50 year, in France you got lucky. I mean, 15 years is nothing. It can take 40 years of each in order to get to the point that say, okay, we learned from that, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. So now let's, according to our mistakes, create something that works. Now my hope is that the internet and the connections, because in Iran people are connected in the big cities, so that connection is going to help that process of understanding what works, what doesn't, right? But in a lot of cases when there's a lot of trauma, a lot of killing, a lot of blood, what you need is a complete change of generation. So we might still have to wait another generation in Iran, because even the current generation has seen too much bloodshed.
But do you think that in Europe or in the US, the government that we have right now is the one that is the most mature and the one that we actually wanted? Because you said it's like a teenager who wants to try things out until he finds what truly goes to him.
Yeah.
And do you think that we have this government right now because the euro is slowly falling apart and democracy is being really challenged, not by its citizens are actually not challenging the idea of democracy, but challenging the government, as they did with the French Revolution. They didn't challenge the king, but they challenged the system.
The system. I think, again, democracy is not a neat little box. Democracy is like water. Democracy is movement. Can I hold a little bit of water in my hand and say, this is all the water there is? No. So this a reality of movement and of water. Democracy without challenge, it dies. Without movement, so this is where the citizens comes in. The citizens need to challenge not only governments, but even the system.
They need to ask questions.
Yes, to say, wait a second, but this law, it can get better. Or the problem they're having in the US right now with the gun, Second Amendment. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
That was written 200 years ago. They had muskets back then that shot 1 bullet every 2 years.
And they were at war.
Yeah, and
they had
it
to
was
fight the
revolution.
Indians, they had to fight the English.
And now they are arguing that the same laws, very democratic indeed, but the laws that were written 200 years ago that ask for every citizen to be armed.
Because it was a time of war.
Things have changed. So that is what the average citizen can forget, that the laws, democratic laws, nevertheless, that were written 200 years ago, they have to be challenged.
Oh, yeah. And I'm kind of sure that Benjamin Franklin would today say, we don't want those
Wait
guns.
a second.
I'm kind of sure.
Exactly. And this is what, I mean, in France, I do, when I speak for a Canadian audience, I have my own way of challenging the Canadian system to get better. And in France, I'm sure there are ways to make it better.
Well, the thing is that I kind of think, well, I don't have much experience or anything, but the French seem to be a grumpy folk.
And that's
like
a good thing.
It is a good
yeah,
thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
It is.
Canadians
because
are complacent.
compared to the US or everything. Because over here we're really not nationalistic if you compare to the USA.
Oh yeah.
And,
and
is
that's
that
a good thing. That's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. Honestly, when I'm here, I find that people are talking about things. People are challenging each other. In Canada, and even in the US, people are scared of challenging old laws, old ways, exactly because they somehow think that it's nationalistic not to challenge old ways of doing things, which is bizarre. It is, the Americans, they challenge the British, and that's how America became America. So now they have to do the same thing, right? So there you go.
Okay, so I guess we're
finished
right now.
So I guess we have to go, yeah. Okay.